Hello and welcome to the Preference Services part of this DMA webcast. My name is Scott Flower and I look after all the UK's preference services. I also have a team of around about 11 members of staff who work for the DMA, and they do an administration function and deal with registrations and complaints for all of the UK's preference services, which of course is what I'm going to talk about to you now. So the first slide, we have all the logos. The preference services are the telephone preference service, the fax preference service, the corporate telephone, the mailing and the baby mailing preference services, as well as the email preference service. The first 5 preference services are managed by the DMA in the UK. The email preference services, however, is managed by the DMA in the States. It's managed on a global basis by them. The regulations in the UK and Europe are slightly different from the regulations overseas, in that you have to have permission before you send somebody an email. So email preference service doesn't really relate to UK citizens or European nationals. Now, the preference services are all DMA codes of practice. So basically, if you're a DMA member, it states that you must not call someone that's registered with the telephone preference service, fax someone that's registered with the fax preference service, or of course mail someone that's registered with the mailing preference service. Now, 3 of the preference services are also legal requirements, so they go slightly beyond the code. They're actually unlawful for you to contact someone via the telephone or fax if they are registered with the telephone, the fax or the corporate telephone preference services. And the regulations are the Privacy and Electronic Communications Regulations 2003. Now, what are the preference services? Basically, they are suppression files. So as a consumer, and in some case businesses, if you wish to stop the receipt of unsolicited sales and marketing telephone calls or sales and marketing material coming through your letterbox, you can actually register with one of the UK's preference services, and that will stop that type of communication coming through to you. Now, once you have registered your address or your telephone number, for example, that data is then sent to licensed companies only, so that they can suppress their own in-house lists against the preference service file. Now, we do ask that companies sign a license agreement with us before they receive the data, and that license agreement will basically say that the data is there to be used for suppression purposes only, and obviously not there to use as a marketing list. The preference service also offer a complaint handling service, which is part of the free service, so there's no charge for anybody to register on any of the UK's preference services, and we also offer a free complaint handling service. So if you are registered with one of the preference services but still continue to receive unsolicited forms of communication, you can actually complain to that preference service, and we will investigate that complaint on your behalf. So let's start off with the mailing preference service. We've got there that data is held at individual levels. So for example, if you live in a household with other people, you can register just yourself to stop the receipt of unsolicited mailings coming through to your door. Other people in the household will continue to receive those mailings. Of course, if everybody in the household wishes to prevent mailings, then they can register individually with the service. Mailing preference service for a direct mailer means that you only need to screen the mailing preference service against your prospect database. The mailing preference service does not cover customer lists. So if you have a prior relationship with a customer, you can in fact continue to mail those. Just to give you some statistics on the mailing preference service, the current file size is just over 4.5 million addresses are currently registered with the mailing preference service. Now, we estimate that this represents around about 20% of all UK homes. So all UK households are currently registered with the mailing preference service. Every year we run an awareness survey which basically asks UK consumers if they have heard of the mailing preference service. Now, currently just under half the people that we ask for, around 46% of UK consumers, say they are aware of the mailing preference service. However, we estimate, as I said before, 20% of all UK households have actually gone to register. So there are a large percentage of people out there that are aware that there is a service that can stop unsolicited mailings coming through, but have yet to go on to register. The next slide talks about Baby Mailing Preference Service, which was a service launched by the Direct Marketing Association in July of 2002. The service works by preventing the receipt of baby-related material. If a lady becomes pregnant, as in most cases, they will sign up to receiving baby-related material. So any information they can get, any freebies that they can receive via the post, they will sign up for those and will obviously gladly welcome those types of material. However, if they suffer a miscarriage or death of a baby, then the mailings that they have asked for will obviously still continue to come through. Now this can be quite distressing and upsetting for the lady that suffered the miscarriage. So the Direct Marketing Association launched Baby MPS to prevent baby-related material coming through. Now the file is updated on a daily basis, so as soon as someone registers, the service will take effect pretty much immediately. Moving on to the telephone preference service. Now the telephone preference service is a legal requirement, as I said before. The Privacy and Electronic Communications regulations state that telemarketers must not contact someone who's registered with the service for more than 28 days, and it is unlawful to do. Now the telephone preference service is there to give protection to individuals. Now an individual under English law is classed as a UK consumer, a sole trader or a partnership. So a consumer, a sole trader and a partnership can register on the telephone preference service to prevent the receipt of unsolicited sales and marketing phone calls. Now whilst the telephone preference service offers the administration of the service, we are not responsible, nor is the DMA, for the enforcement of the regulations. That role falls down to the Information Commissioner's Office. The Information Commissioner's Office therefore has the powers to issue enforcement notices to companies that are not being compliant. The telephone preference service does cover customer lists, and this is the big difference between the telephone preference service and the mailing preference service. Even if you as a telemarketer have a previous relationship with a customer, you must not call them in relation to sales and marketing calls if they are registered with the telephone preference service. Now the only way to get around this rule is by gaining permission. If your customer has given you permission to call, then that permission will override the telephone preference service. It will override their subscription to the service. As I said before, registration is effective within 28 days. Again, just to give you some statistics on the telephone preference service, we currently have over 15.5 million individual telephone numbers registered with the service, and we estimate that that represents around about 55 to 60% of all UK landlines are currently registered with the telephone preference service. Again, we do an annual consumer awareness survey, and currently awareness levels for the telephone preference service are around 54%. So what this slide is telling us is that half the UK population are in fact aware of the telephone preference service, and half the UK population have actually gone on to register. If you look back to the slide for the mailing preference service, it displays a slightly different picture, which would indicate that people find telephone sales calls more intrusive than they do with the receipt of direct mailings. The next slide shows you the growth of the telephone preference service since 2002 to 2010, and you can see around 2003 to 2006 there was a huge increase in the numbers that were registering for the telephone preference service. In fact, we saw just over 10 million numbers going on the file within that 3 to 4 year period. Why? Well, silent calls, which are generated by companies using auto dialers. An auto dialer will, for example, dial 20 telephone numbers but only have 15 operators available to answer the call. So the first 15 people that answer their phones will get through to an operator. However, the remaining 5 will just hear silent. Now, registering with the telephone preference service may have an effect at reducing the receipt of silent calls. It really depends on the purpose of that call. If the call was for sales and marketing purposes, then of course telephone preference service should have prevented that call coming through. However, companies use auto dialers for purposes such as debt collection, market research, and those types of calls are not covered under the regulations that surround TPS. Text messages and recorded messages should only be sent with prior permission. So you should only send these if you have the permission of the recipient. Again, a large majority of consumers will not realise this, and they will think that registering with a telephone preference service will prevent the receipt of silent calls, text messages and recorded messages calls. Also, British Telecom launched their BT Privacy service in around 2005. Now that service alone added around 6 to 7 million telephone numbers in just a year. Moving on to the corporate telephone preference service. The corporate telephone preference service is there to offer corporations, and by that I mean limited companies, PLCs, government bodies, schools, hospitals, etc., the same protection that TPS offers individuals. Currently we have around about 1.5 million telephone numbers registered with that service, which started in May 2004. The majority of companies who register for the corporate telephone service register just 1 or 2 numbers with the service. The majority are therefore micro businesses or small to medium enterprises that have less than 10 employees. The key difference between the telephone preference service and the corporate telephone preference service is that subscribers to the corporate TPS need to renew their registrations on an annual basis. The TPS will send the subscribers an email giving them an opportunity to renew the number or numbers that they have registered every year. Currently, renewal rate is around about 67%. So what happens if you don't comply? Well, of course, as I've mentioned, the TPS, corporate TPS and fax preference service are all legal requirements, so therefore the Information Commissioner's Office can issue enforcement notices and ultimately a fine to companies who are non-compliant. The Mail-in Preference Service liaises with the Advertising Standards Authority, the ASA, and does provide detailed reports on complaints received to the ASA. Another sanction is of course media publicity. Let's face it, nobody wants to appear on BBC Watchdog. And of course, non-compliance could lead to damage of a company reputation or brand. And also, ultimately, it could lead to more restrictive legislation. Well, that's all from me. Thanks very much for listening. If you do want information on the preference services, obviously the best way to obtain this is by visiting the website. Here are a list of all the websites for each individual preference service. If you click on those sites, it will take you through to the registration section, but you can link through to what we call the licensee website, which will give you more information on purchasing the files. If you are a telemarketer or a mailing house, please visit these websites if you are not a current licensee and learn how you can be compliant. We do have cost-effective ways of screening your data against the relevant preference service, and all the details are contained on these websites. Thank you very much.